everyone. Welcome to the Nemeth Report podcast. I'm Dr. Tammy Nemeth, energy historian, analyst, consultant, and I'll be your host. Today, it's my absolute pleasure to be joined by Kent J. Williamson to discuss one of my favorite topics, and that is the history of hydrocarbons. Kent has written an excellent book, American Heat Engine, Hydrocarbons and the Power of the United States. And he's going to take us through it in this, hopefully, really amicable conversation. Hi, Kent. Welcome to the program.
Hi, Tammy. Thank you for having me on. Really looking
it's a pleasure. It's a pleasure. You have a bit of an interesting background, and I'm wondering if you can just take a moment to introduce yourself to the audience.
Sure. So I grew up in Colorado in the United States, and I didn't have any direct connection to oil and gas or coal or anything like that. If you read my bio, I kind of put a little blurb in there about I grew up near Coal Mine Road in Littleton, Colorado. It's a suburb of Denver. And turns out there actually were coal mines out there a long time before, but I didn't even really know that. So, but I did grow up there, and then I served in the military in the U.S. Marines, also a little bit of time in the Navy. And through those years, and then I ended up getting out and got into the business world, and I did a few different jobs. But in 2007, I ended up with a company called IHS in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and that's where I am today, right now. My wife is from Tulsa, and there's a few different reasons we ended up in Tulsa. But I started with IHS. And then I spent 15 and a half years with that company. It ended up changing into IHS Market. And then a few years ago, it merged with S&P Global. And then I ended up leaving about 2.5 years ago now and had the chance to write this book. But through those 15 years or so, I was exposed to the energy industry from basically upstream exploration, production, oil and gas, to midstream and downstream. We also had people, I wasn't directly involved with coal, but we had groups that looked at coal, and I was able to, exposed to that side of things too. So I learned a lot about it. And then, that, as you can read in the introduction to the book, is kind of what led me to write this book. But I just found, kind of in summary, that, it's a fascinating subject. It's an important subject. And then I found, it wasn't really covered in American history. There's certain things that are, but anyway, I decided why not give it a shot to write a book on this.
Well, you're right. I think that a lot of the sort of energy history or oil hydrocarbon history will focus on specific things or a specific time period, or there's been this kind of specialization in certain areas. But what I really enjoyed about your book is that you cover the whole thing.
Yeah.
And you go from like the beginning until now, and the beginning is very early. And I think that's kind of what has been missing in it. It fills a nice gap where you provide this really nice broad overview of these interconnections between the different hydrocarbons and how none of them really go away. And yeah. I think that'll be a fun thing to get into further in the conversation, is just how, as we talk about on the Energy Realities podcast, it's an energy addition. And so we have these different things and they add on over time.
Yes, that's a part that, I wasn't aware of. And it's like, I keep finding out new things the more I research and keep reading, even after I finish with this book, is the interrelationships between the hydrocarbons. It's really fascinating. But
yeah, for sure.
As you mentioned, that was one of the challenges when I started writing the book or thinking about it, was how do I write something like, because it's a very broad topic and it's also very deep. I mean, there's a lot of details and it's technical, as you know. Energy is not, simple. And same time, I also, when I was researching writing books, I found people's attention spans are less and less these days with all the different distractions, or alternatives, phones, cable TV channels, everything else. People are not reading super long books. And so I was trying to figure out a way to write it in such a way that it's understandable and, a fairly easy read, but it also covers the subject.
Yeah, and I thought it was really great, and I highly recommend it to people. I know in the beginning you talk a little bit about in your introduction, um, going on a road trip and being inspired by Daniel Yergin. And Daniel Yergin, he wrote The Prize, and he was also the founder of IHS, which and he's developed that company, who you worked for like to be this really great
But
sort of analytical company. And his book, The Prize, is just incredible. Um, so can you talk a little bit about that personal road trip, how that helped you shape the narrative?
sure. And just to clarify, so I did, that's how I found out about IHS was I read Dan Jurgens' The Prize. And I was in a bookstore one day and I saw the book. I had never heard of it. I had never heard of him, but I do, I love history. And I read it, but he actually founded what was called Cambridge Energy Research Associates. And
Yeah.
then it was about 20 years ago when I read that book, about 2005. And then they had been acquired by IHS the year before in 2004. And so then I was kind of looking for jobs at the time. And then I looked up IHS and they were based in Denver, which is where I grew up. And I'd never even heard of them. And it's an interesting company with an interesting backstory I won't get into here, but I ended up hiring on. They acquired a small geology software company here in Tulsa, and they were hiring a product manager. And I had product management experience, but I didn't have oil and gas or geology experience. But I ended up getting the job, and that's kind of what got me going. But in that 15 years I was with the company, so I started in 2007, and the software was called Petra, and it was a geology software written by a geologist. And little did I know I was at ground zero for the unconventional revolution in the United States. It had started years before, and I get into that in the book. But at that point, it was really hitting critical mass, especially on the natural gas side. The Barnett Shale and the Haynesville, sorry, I got those two mixed up, were really going strong. The Marcellus out in the east was just starting to pick up and so forth. And then the oil side of it was just going to get going in about the next year or two. So I learned all about that. And it was really fascinating because, this is when I started finding out things that I had no idea about. So the gentleman that wrote the software, he had worked for City Service here in Tulsa. And I was like, I never even heard of that company. And it's like a historic company. It later became Citgo, and that's what most people are familiar with it as. But they had done a whole bunch of stuff, some of which I cover in the book. But I also found it was really fascinating because there were so many oil and gas wells in the United States. And I would ask, why is that? And I was told, well, I mean, there's one of the main reasons that we have private mineral rights in the United States. And we're basically the only country in the world that's the case. And so that's a big factor in the industry essentially starting here, and then the massive production and the number of wells. So like one time we went and visited a gentleman who had a Petra project, and he had it on one computer, and it was a really powerful computer. He had every well in the United States in this Petra project. So there was at the time about 4.5 million wells. And he could zoom out and show contours and maps for the entire United States, and then zoom into a specific area. So it was really neat. So that was one of the kind of inspiring things that I learned. And then later when I actually went up to Denver to our headquarters, and we acquired some chemical analysis consulting companies. And this was around 2010, 2011. And I didn't know much at all about chemicals, and even though they're called petrochemicals, and that means they come from oil and natural gas. But I found out at that time the U.S. chemical industry was undergoing a renaissance. It had been gutted; a lot of its production had been moved overseas. And but with the cheap natural gas and the natural gas liquids coming out of the unconventional revolution, the U.S. chemical industry was being reborn, especially along the Gulf Coast. So, and then I later got to do a kind of a research role for refining and marketing Latin America. So I was analyzing, the downstream sector in Latin America. And that's where I learned so much about how interrelated Latin America and North America are as far as hydrocarbons go. We call it the Latin America, or the America's refining system, and
Yeah.
Canada is involved in this as well. And but I learned a few things. I was invited to actually speak at a coal conference in Colombia that we hosted, and I was the refining and marketing guy. Well, they wanted to know about fuel oil because a lot of the Latin American refineries put out a lot of fuel oil, and that can be substituted for coal and so forth. They're also interested in the petroleum coke, a very obscure refined product that's left over from coking heavy sour crudes. But I got to visit a refinery in Chile, and the Chilean refineries are actually some of the best in Latin America. But the refinery manager told me, he goes, if it wasn't for government support that we get, I couldn't even compete with the U.S. Gulf Coast refineries because they have such cheap natural gas and cheap electricity. And he said, I'm relying on LNG that's like $12 to $15 an MMBTU. He goes, even with the shipping costs, they can outcompete me all the way over here in Chile. And I was like, man, that's incredible. And, it just made me really appreciate the refining sector, the petrochemical sector, especially along the U.S. Gulf Coast, and then the role that the unconventional revolution, the links to Canada, so the heavy sour crude that comes down from the Canadian oil sands, so forth. Really fascinating. So that's there's a bunch more I could say, but that's some of the reason, some of the things I was exposed to along the way that kind of inspired me to write the book.
Well, and it's interesting because your experience has gone through so many different branches of the industry that and then to spark your interest in this historical thing, like where did it all come from? How did this start? How did we get into this sort of position where we are today? And I think one of the only other jurisdictions in the world that does have private property rights, as you describe in the United States, is parts of Canada. And
yes.
So it's interesting when you look at how that development has happened in North America and Canada and the United States. There is that similarity with respect to property rights.
Yes,
is important.
Yeah, and it's interesting because that in the introduction of the book, I mentioned my grandfather's family farm in North Dakota. So I still own partial mineral rights to some of that land where my mother had a part of that left. And unfortunately, it's like right on the edge of the Bakken. So they drilled some wells there. They were dry holes back in the 80s, and they've never, maybe someday it'll expand out there, but it's kind of on the edge of the productive part of the Bakken. So.
Oh, darn. So if we kind of progress through the book a little bit, I know that my interest, of course, is sort of what happened in the 20th century and after World War II, and the sort of dynamics of the geopolitical aspects of that history. But a lot of people don't understand how important hydrocarbons were, especially coal, in the early days. Mm-hmm. Particularly, for people forget that you need coal to make steel and to make iron and whatnot. And I'm wondering if we can just maybe start near the beginning there, where you talk about the early hydrocarbons up to the Industrial Revolution. And one of the interesting narrative threads that you use is this idea of strategic hydrocarbon bridges. Yes. And I'm wondering if you can explain a little bit why you chose that imagery and the significance of strategic hydrocarbon bridges in the context of that of your narrative.
And that was, like I mentioned, I was trying to figure out how to write this book. And it's interesting because I initially started out, I was really interested with in the private mineral rights. And so I was actually going to try to write a book on that. But then I got into that and I was like, this is pretty academic. It's very legal and complex. And I'm not smart enough to write a book on that. And I don't think anyone would read it other than probably, other academics. So I decided to try to write just a general history of hydrocarbons in the United States. And then I started writing it and I was like, this thing's going to be, 800 or 1,000 pages long. It's going to be like an encyclopedia. And, again, it's going to take forever, and I don't think anyone's going to read it. So I was really thinking about it. But as I kept going through everything, I just noticed that there were some fairly discrete periods and geographies where the American hydrocarbon industry kind of went through. And that, by using those concepts, I could kind of hit the highlights and give kind of hopefully an interesting story of how it progressed and cover the whole thing, but not dive into so much detail that people are going to be overwhelmed. So, and I didn't mention at the beginning, but I do really hope that people that are not familiar with hydrocarbons or not in the industry or whatever read this book. And that's part of the reason I wrote it, because I think there's a lot of, it's not covered in a lot of history, so people just don't know about it. And I also think there's a lot of, misinformation out there about energy, hydrocarbons, and so forth. So I chose these bridges because I just kind of came to the conclusion it's the best way I could do it to hit the highlights and make it interesting and cover everything. So.
Yeah. Okay. Because that's kind of the sense I got from reading it, is to try and make sense of all of these different things and how do you tie it all together across such a long period of time. One of the fascinating stories that your book talks about is the War of 1812.
Yes.
And people, I think it's a pity that we don't know enough about the history of that period with the War of 1812 and the sort of first beginnings of the Industrial Revolution. And I think what's interesting is the strategic importance of coal, even in the War of 1812.
Yes.
And salt production.
Yeah.
I thought that was really fascinating how you brought salt into that. Can you speak a little bit to that?
Sure. So, and that's what I call salt the honorary American hydrocarbon, because it has many connections to hydrocarbons that are fascinating. So, and then in the War of 1812, the section that it's in, I call it underrated. And it's often overlooked. It's looked at as kind of a unnecessary war between the United States and Great Britain. And it was, there were a lot of follies and things like that. But it was very important in the long run, because it did, it cut off, at the time, the United States got most of its coal from Great Britain. And, Great Britain was already well underway in their industrial revolution, and they were using coal extensively because they had cut down most of their trees. And so they knew how to use it. And then they would basically just ship it over in ballast on ships. So they would come to the United States, unload coal, and then they would load up other stuff and go back or go somewhere else. We also had kind of the first major coal deposit in the United States was in Virginia, right around what's now the capital city of Virginia, Richmond. And that coal was mined. It was easy to get to the James River, the Chesapeake Bay, and then out. And it would go up and down the East Coast. Well, the British, of course, cut off their own coal and that Virginia coal with the Royal Navy during the War of 1812. So there was a shortage. I call it the first American energy crisis. And that stimulated the search for and movement of coal that was already known. So most specifically, there was a form of coal called anthracite, or hard coal, in eastern Pennsylvania, which was well known. It was just tough to get out to like places like Philadelphia and New York City, which were the growing cities. So people had been using it, but War of 1812 really stimulated that. And then salt also was imported in a lot of cases. So there was some salt production in the United States, but a lot of it was imported from British Caribbean colonies and elsewhere, and especially to the East Coast cities like Boston, New York, Philadelphia. And salt is something, kind of another thing that I didn't know. I put salt on my food and like the taste, but it's like back then, I mean, it was necessary for survival. There was no refrigeration, of course, so that's how people preserved meat, and especially in frontier areas of the United States, you couldn't survive without it. And the Native Americans used it as well. But it turns out eastern United States, especially kind of the Appalachia and the Ohio River Valley, is a huge salt producing area. There's a lot of natural salt springs and salt licks where the wildlife would congregate. They were hunting spots and so forth. And over time, especially after the War of 1812, when the salt was cut off, then people started digging for salt brine and drilling for it. And that basically became the early beginnings of the oil and natural gas industry, because this area also has a lot of oil and natural gas, which had been observed for decades. And in drilling for salt brine, a lot of times oil and natural gas were produced. And a lot of times they were either discarded. I mean, natural gas couldn't be used for the most part. It was just vented into the atmosphere. Oil was either discarded or it was used in kind of patent medicine
Yeah.
things. So it developed through the 1800s. So that was a fascinating thing that came out of the War of 1812. The other was trying to, it was conducted over quite a large region. And at that time, it was very, most of the United States was still very remote and rugged. There weren't roads or railroads, of course. And so it stimulated a lot of desire to improve infrastructure. They called it internal improvements back then. So canals, railroads, turnpike roads, and so forth. And of course, everyone knows about the Erie Canal, which connected the Great Lakes to the Hudson River in New York City. But it also stimulated the canals in eastern Pennsylvania that ended up carrying anthracite hard coal to the East Coast, especially the Northeast. And that's where the American Industrial Revolution got going. And anthracite played a huge role in that.
So can you talk a little bit about the different types of coal? And one of the important aspects is transportation, as you mentioned, the growth of canals, because as with a lot of different resources, quite often the resources are found some distance away from where the demand is, where people are using it the most for industry or whatever. And so then it becomes a matter of how do you build up that infrastructure? How do you build up the roads, the transportation infrastructure in order to get it to the market that needs it? And with the war in 1812, that really, as you point out so brilliantly in your book, is that it's this kind of kick in the pants like
Yes.
that America needs to start building up its own resources and not be so vulnerable to being cut off from by another foreign power. And so there's a certain element of security of your own resources and being able to build up your own capabilities of manufacturing and whatnot through the use of these resources. So what are these different types of coal and why is that important?
Well, and I neglected to mention when we were talking about the War of 1812, and you mentioned coal being used in iron and steel production. Well, originally in the United States, mostly what was used in those iron applications at the time was charcoal, which was derived from wood. And that there's a lot of reasons for it, but one of them was that the eastern United States has a lot of trees. The whole eastern United States is basically a huge forest. It was back then. And people knew how to make charcoal. It goes back millennia, especially in Europe and Asia. So they knew how to do that, and it was easy to do. And the American colonies quickly became a leading iron producing one of the leading iron producing centers in the world, even though the British tried to suppress it in some ways. And it was mostly using charcoal. But charcoal, takes a lot of trees, and it also requires the iron furnaces and forges and so forth to be kind of in remote areas where there's a lot of trees. So over time, there was a demand for higher energy density coal and the ability to have manufacturing production closer to the centers of population, like Philadelphia, New York City, and so forth. So the main types of coal, there's four main types. And they basically go from highest to lowest in energy content or calorific value. And the top one is called hard coal or anthracite. And then the next one is bituminous, and there's different ways to pronounce that. So I've heard it bituminous or bituminous, but it's the most common one. And then there's subbituminous, which is just a lower energy content form of bituminous. And then finally lignite, which is a kind of a lower quality. We have all four in the United States. The United States has the most coal resources in any country in the world. So the anthracite is interesting because it's basically in eastern Pennsylvania, and that's about it. There are some forms of anthracite in present-day Rhode Island and Massachusetts, but they were relatively small. They weren't as high quality as the Pennsylvania, and they were hard to mine. So the Pennsylvania anthracite was kind of the key. The challenge with it is it's like if you've ever tried to start a fire when you're out camping, if you throw some really kind of flimsy pine wood on, it'll usually ignite pretty easily. But if you throw a piece of hardwood, like oak or something like that, it takes a long time. You have to have a fire going to get it going. Anthracite's kind of the same way. It's hard to ignite, but once you get it going, it burns for a long time. So it's energy dense, and then it doesn't smoke a lot, which has got some key advantages. Bituminous coal was the most widespread in the United States, and the center of it at the time was western Pennsylvania around Pittsburgh, literally right across the river from downtown Pittsburgh. It's called Mount Washington now, but it was called Coal Hill. So they used it for a long time. Of course, back then you couldn't get it to the East Coast. And then subbituminous, which I get into later in the book, is centered more in the western United States, mainly in Wyoming and Montana. And that came to importance much later. Lignite is kind of the lowest quality. We have a lot of it, especially up in North Dakota, including on my grandfather's farm. And then there's actually a lot of it in the Gulf Coast of mainly Texas. So those are the four main ones. They all play different important parts in American hydrocarbon history, even to this day.
Yeah, it's interesting because I know we'll talk about it in a little bit, but with the energy crisis, there was all this big move in the 70s to swap over the electrical generation from, there was quite a lot of oil being used for electrical, to coal, because they figured, well, we have a lot of coal, why not? It'll help us fight the energy crisis. It's cheap, and we can have, do this kind of swap over. And then we have the war on coal that started happening probably about 10 years ago or so, maybe earlier, 10 to 15 years, where Mike Bloomberg was really beyond coal campaign and so on.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And one other thing I forgot to mention on coal is bituminous coal. There is a subset of that that's called metallurgical coal. There's certain types of it that's great for smelting, for iron and steel production. So very important for that. And I get those comments occasionally where people say, we're going to move beyond coal. And, for instance, there was a recent announcement. There's a company in Alabama that's just opened up a new mine. It's metallurgical coal. And people say, well, we're not going to need that much longer. It's like, well, last time I checked, there's not really a substitute for that, and making steel is still pretty important. So that will probably be there for a long time, if not, for however long we're around. So
right. I mean, it's so bizarre because, like, in Canada, there's a ban on exporting coal that's used for power generation, but there's a lot of very good metallurgical coal in British Columbia and Alberta. And so the mines in British Columbia have increased significantly, exporting the metallurgical coal to China to make steel.
Yes.
So, yeah. And in the UK, it's crazy where they had greenlit a coal plant or a coal mine. And one of the first thing Labour did was cancel the permit for the new coal mine, even though a big chunk of it would have been used for metallurgy. But so it's this weird thing that's happening. And I'm glad that your book tries to dispel some of or at least bring to light the real history behind the importance of these resources, behind hydrocarbons, and why it's important.
Yeah, that's what I was going to mention. I mean, I wrote it to make it it's a history of hydrocarbons in the United States. And my position is that there have been good. I mean, it focuses on the good that they've done, we all know that there's plenty of side effects, and there's been bad aspects of it. But I partially was inspired by Alex Epstein and the moral case for fossil fuels and so forth, and he always points out that it's in the current day and age, it's often the total focus is on the bad things about hydrocarbons or fossil fuels. They're polluting, the climate effects and all that. But I wanted to do this to focus on the good things they've done, and I did choose to focus on the United States. But I also point out a lot of things that worldwide that has been good about American hydrocarbons as well. On the coal side, I was going to mention also that those coal plants that you mentioned were built during the 70s, 80s, the energy crisis. That's kind of one of the key issues we're facing now is those coal plants are coming up on 50 years old or more, and so they're hitting kind of the end of their life, and some of they're also their economics, given the current structure of electric power generation and so forth, is they're not economic anymore as well, due to regulatory pressures and so forth. So we're seeing a lot of those being retired for various reasons. And, at the same time, we're seeing electric power generation go up, or power demand go up. And, where are we going to meet that? So it's kind of an interesting time to contemplate that.
Yeah, that's a great point. We talk about it a lot on the Energy Realities podcast about how there's trade-offs with anything. And unfortunately, in the conversation around hydrocarbons, as you point out, that it's only the negative side. You don't hear about the benefits. And with anything, there's a cost-benefit analysis that needs to be done. And if you're only focusing on the downsides, then you're not making an appropriate decision. You don't have all the information. You don't have all the context that's required in order to come to appropriate and correct decisions. So if we kind of keep going in a chronological order to sort of go back a little bit, I think one of the fascinating developments was with the Civil War, because as the coal production increases on the East Coast, and there's a growth of the sort of industrialization, that seems to have been a real benefit to the North in the Civil War, and one could say had a significant impact on the outcome of the Civil War.
Yes, and that's what I try to point out. And one of the interesting things that is the timing of the Civil War. It was early 1860s, but if you step back, and I try to cover this in the book, into the 1850s, it's amazing some of the things that happened right before that. And so mentioned coal. So there's actually an obscure kind of coal called cannel coal, and technically, I've seen a lot of reference to it that it's not actually coal; it's more of an oil shale. But regardless, it was called cannel coal. And during the 1850s, people found that it was one of the best ways to generate manufactured gas. So I get into the whole history of manufactured gas in the early 1800s, but cannel coal was good for generating manufactured gas, but it was also good for distilling oil, so coal oil, out of the coal. And then that is basically what kickstarted a lot of the methods that were used later to refine petroleum when that started. So you have, in the 1850s, you have the salt drilling, and you're producing oil and natural gas really expanding. And then you have the cannel coal and the coal oil refining, and all that comes together in 1859 with the Drake well in Western Pennsylvania. And so that's when the American petroleum industry is born. Then there's a lot of natural gas as well. And the petroleum industry did function through the Civil War. It didn't play a huge role, but it did play some important roles, which I'm still learning about even after I finished the book. Then, as you mentioned, the coal was extremely important. So basically what happened is 1840, it was actually July 4th, 1840, was when they first smelted. It was actually a British guy that came over. They recruited him to come over, and he successfully smelted iron with anthracite in Pennsylvania, the Lehigh Valley, Pennsylvania. From there, the American Industrial Revolution really hit another, a higher gear. And of course, most of the coal in the industry is in the, in the North. And that was a huge reason that the North was able to, keep the Union together because of that industrial production. And I get into a lot of details on that, but everything from railroads to armament manufacture to the ability to supply the naval power, that's actually my background. I went to the Naval Academy and we learned a lot about that. And but to this day, I think that part of the Civil War is overshadowed, because the decisive battles, of course, were on land, Gettysburg and so forth, but the Navy played a huge role in being able to support those. And it isn't covered as much, and it was important. And there's kind of this sense that the South was better, they had better generals, better fighting spirit. In a lot of cases that was true, but it's never really acknowledged that the task that the North had to achieve was huge. I mean, if you look at the size of the South, it's like the size of Western Europe. And at that time, I mean, there's no motor vehicles, no aircraft, things like that. To conquer, a area that size is no small task. And hydrocarbons, especially coal, played a huge role in that. And so they held the United States, they contributed to holding the United States together, which, has had, I think, huge implications for world history ever since.
Yeah, what I really liked about your book is how you wove in the technological developments. So you had the steamboats and how important the steamboats were. And then what are you using in order to generate that steam, and how the coal made such a huge difference. And then later you have like the ironclads. The ironclads start coming along, and where are you getting the ironclads from, and all this kind of thing. And then with the salt brine and the drilling techniques, and then how that was then used for the oil and gas drilling, and then all of these other technological developments along the way, which was just absolutely fascinating to see how one thing leads to another thing, and then there's these other elements that work together to produce another new development.
Yes. Yeah, and that's, you mentioned the ironclads. That's another area of the Civil War. We always, in American history classes and so forth, you always cover the Monitor and the Merrimack, the famous battle of the ironclads on the East Coast. But at the end of the day, those, I mean, they were very notable and they were kind of romantic and interesting, but those really didn't have much of an impact on, the Monitor later sank because it was, out in the ocean. But the river ironclads had a huge impact in basically, taking the Union of the North, taking control of the Mississippi River and the Ohio River. And that was the Anaconda Plan, the ability to invade the South and then, strangle it economically. And it was interesting. My daughter goes to college in Nashville, Tennessee, the country music hub and so forth. But it's a Civil War site as well. And, I didn't really realize, but the Union actually took control of that in 1862, which is pretty early in the war. And one of the main reasons they were able to do that was they had used riverboats, including ironclads, to take control of some key forts at the junction of the Ohio River and the Tennessee and Cumberland rivers. And then they were able to just come down. So the Confederacy just evacuated Nashville because it was indefensible, and the Union naval power took control of that. And then Nashville was very important for supplying future campaigns, including General Sherman's drive through the South via railroad and so forth. So Nashville was really important. It's just not, it wasn't the site of huge battles and things like that. So
it was a good choke point to have, for sure. Yeah. So if I can bring it back a little bit to the bridges concept. So how did the Appalachian and Midwest bridges lay the groundwork for the modern oil and gas industries?
So, as I mentioned, the American oil industry, born at 1859 at Titusville, Pennsylvania, and then it expanded through the Civil War, but it really got going afterwards. And then, of course, Standard Oil, John D. Rockefeller, which a lot of people are familiar with in the late 1800s. Natural gas kind of followed along. It was often produced with oil, but people, it couldn't be used and so forth. Kind of in the 1870s, 1880s, it got going mainly in Western Pennsylvania around Pittsburgh. So that area was kind of Western Pennsylvania was really the heart of the American oil and natural gas industry. But a good example of a strategic hydrocarbon bridge that I'll use on this, just because we can't go through the whole book, but is what I call the Midwest Oil and Natural Gas Bridge. And it's kind of an obscure one that a lot of people aren't familiar with, but it's important because you had the start of the oil and natural gas industry in the kind of the 1860s, 1870s, and so forth in the 1880s. But in Ohio in 1885 was when the Lima heavy sour crude was discovered around Lima, Ohio. And so that's the first major oil discovery outside kind of the Appalachian core. So we're into the U.S. Midwest at this point. There you go. And so that is important geographically because it's as the Midwest was still developing, and the Midwest, of course, ends up becoming part of the U.S. industrial heartland. And so then Chicago, which is on Lake Michigan, was growing. It's a railroad center, and Standard Oil ends up building a refinery just outside of Chicago in Whiting, Indiana. And Whiting, Indiana, that refinery is still in existence today. It's actually owned by BP. And that's very important because Standard built a pipeline, but that heavy sour crude could not be refined with the techniques available at that time. So I get into it in the book, but in the end of the day, they figured out how to refine this crude to get the sulfur out. There was a certain gentleman named Herman Frasch who did that. But that refinery later becomes of major importance for a variety of refining advances in American and world history. A little around the same time, there was a well called the Great Carg Well in Ohio, but then from that was a natural gas well that actually blew out, and it was like on fire. It was like a tourist attraction. But from that, they had a natural gas boom in neighboring Indiana, and that there was like an industrial boom. All these glass and other industrial companies moved there and so forth. And then they built a natural gas pipeline to Chicago as well, and replaced the manufactured gas there. Anyway, that natural gas ended up, for a variety of reasons, kind of running out. But that extended oil and natural gas into the Midwest, connected to Chicago, which became America's second city, major industrial hub, transportation hub, and so forth. And that in turn later becomes very important when the oil industry especially expands into the Gulf Coast and the mid-continent. So I get into Spindletop in 1901 and Glenpool in Oklahoma, which is literally just about 5 miles from where I'm sitting right now, in 1905. But that connection between the Gulf Coast, the mid-continent, like Oklahoma, southeastern Kansas, and then back to the Midwest, Chicago, so forth, is very important. So that's an example. That Midwest oil and natural gas bridge is an example of a strategic hydrocarbon bridge. It's very discrete, and it also has broader historical implications, refining technology, natural gas transport, and so forth. The other interesting thing about it, I'll end up on this, is the boom didn't last very long. The oil side was overshadowed by Spindletop, Oklahoma, and so forth pretty quickly, starting in the early 1900s. The natural gas kind of ran out in the Midwest. But Standard had developed a natural gas in West Virginia and so forth, and they started piping more of it into the Midwest. So you start seeing the development of a natural gas network, but also there's a lot of coal in the Ohio River Valley. So southern Ohio, southern Indiana, southern Illinois. So when the natural gas ran out, a lot of times they had to fall back on coal. So trusty old coal is there when it's needed. And then the other interesting thing is that heavy sour crude generated a lot of times when they couldn't refine it, they would just top it. So they would get rid of some of the volatile hydrocarbons, and they would use it as fuel oil. And
Yeah.
so fuel oil at that time started, especially in the industrial areas of Appalachia and the Midwest, started substituting for coal. And I have a little quote from the Standard Oil marketing brochure about the advantages of fuel oil over coal. So really interesting kind of strategic hydrocarbon bridge. But that's an example of how I'm trying to, cover some of those things in the book.
Yeah, I really enjoyed that one. That was, well, I enjoyed all the book, but that one stood out. So then we come to sort of, when you talk about 1901 and Spindletop, we get into how oil starts to have a position of dominance in the 20th century. And I'm wondering, what role do you think it played in World War One?
Well, so when Spindletop happened, just so happened that was right around the time that the automobile industry was being born. So, of course, internal combustion engines developed in Europe, especially Germany, in the late 1800s. And then first automobiles started coming out, including in the United States. And then, of course, what I point out is 1908 was when Ford introduced the Model T, which, before that, cars had been kind of more for people of higher means. Most people couldn't afford them. But the Model T changed that. More and more people could afford it. So that's when oil started switching over so oil had primarily been used to refine kerosene in the late 1800s, and that was lamp oil. By the way, that lamp oil saved the whales, because before that,
exactly.
whales had been, hunted almost to extinction, primarily for whale oil for use in lamps and candles. So, or the spermaceti from the sperm whale. So anyway, that's one positive benefit of oil: save the whales. And but now in the early 1900s, people start driving, and that's when you have mobility. So you asked about World War One. That's a really interesting part of World War One was the motor vehicles. So the aircraft or airplanes were also born in the early 1900s with the Wright brothers in the United States and so forth. By World War One, you have a lot of motorized vehicles: trucks, cars, motorcycles, airplanes. The armored tank was invented. And then on the ship side, that's when the Navy, the Royal Navy, especially switched over from coal to fuel oil. And the Germans effectively used the diesel-powered submarines, the U-boats, in World War One. But one of the most decisive factors in World War One was the Germans did not have as many motor vehicles as the Allies did: the French, the British, and then later the Americans. And there's a decisive point. Dan Jurgen really does a great job of describing this in The Prize, but it's called the Taxi Armada. It's one particular battle where the Germans are coming in and they're almost ready to break through, and probably would have forced France to surrender. But the French rallied all these taxis and other private vehicles to ferry troops to the front, and that kind of saved the day. But then the Allies made much better use of motor vehicles, so trucks and so forth, to move troops back and forth along the line. The Germans were more rail-centric. And then when the United States came in, the United States ended up supplying most of the oil and refined products to the Allies. And then the United States came in and provided a huge number of new troops, and that was kind of decisive in ending that war. And then I don't use this particular quote, but there's a Lord Curzon, I think is who said the Allies floated to victory on a wave of oil.
Yes.
What he didn't say is that was mostly American oil, but that kind of mobility is what was decisive. And then mobility, of course, is what really developed economies, along with electricity, from that point on. And the automobile industry took off in the United States, especially. After that, through the 1920s, that's when you see more people driving. You see more the gas stations, service stations, the highway network. I've been posting a lot recently on U.S. Highway 66 or Route 66 from Chicago to Los Angeles, all that kind of stuff. And the automobile industry itself is a gigantic industry. It uses a ton of steel, aluminum, plastics, fuel, all kinds of things. So it's important economically for the United States and other countries, Canada as well, and it has been for Europe. It's getting tougher and tougher in Europe, as you've pointed out several times. So.
Yeah. it's interesting because what they learned from World War One with respect to the importance of oil in particular for fueling the military machines, um, they executed properly during World War Two, where there was the the Germans learned from that as well. It's one of the reasons why um, in the interwar period there was the massive buildup of the Autobahn when
Hmm.
when Dwight Eisenhower was a young guy in the military. He was put on this trip to see how they could navigate across the United States on the roads. And
Yep.
I've seen pictures at the Eisenhower Archive. It's just terrible, just
Yes.
terrible. He's like, we need a highway system.
Yeah.
How are
Yeah.
we
It
going
took
to
them
move?
like 3 weeks
Yeah,
to get
yeah.
across the country.
Yeah, it was insane and just a mess, depending on where you're going across different regions. It was just muddy or
Uh,
ruts and everything. So,
well, that's something I'd point out about World War II. I mean, even at that time, we didn't have interstate highway system in the United States. I mean, we did have a national highway system, and they were pretty good in some areas, not so good in others. But at that time, most of the transcontinental transportation that was so important to industry, mobility was still
it was
railroads.
still rail.
And
Yeah.
the railroads were still using coal in World War II. There were some using fuel oil, but the diesel electric locomotive didn't come until after World War II. So again, coal, filling in kind of behind the scenes there. So
Right. And so you have the kerosene being used for aircraft or whatever. You've got probably coal still running the ships, maybe fuel oil to some extent. Or maybe more fuel oil. So there's this huge transition, but coal is still there,
yes,
and it's like I said at the outset, it's adding to the different uses of the different types of hydrocarbons, not necessarily taking them away.
yeah,
And I think natural gas really starts to play a role after World War II, maybe as it becomes used more for industrial production, um, maybe as they're getting better with the pipelines, maybe
yes.
that's part of it. What's your sense of it?
Well, natural gas after World War One it had been used quite a bit. Like I mentioned, in Western Pennsylvania, parts of the Midwest, Appalachia, and so forth. But the gas was running out in a lot of those cases. So there was the search. And then that's what I get into in one section is called Gas Goes the Distance. That's in searching for oil. They actually found huge natural gas fields in present day Western Kansas, the
Yeah.
panhandle of Oklahoma, and North Texas. But they couldn't use it, obviously. But then at that point, pipeline technology, manufacturing, and installation advanced enough where they laid some pipelines in the 1920s to the Midwest. And that became very important to U.S. industrial production. Appalachian Appalachia at the time of World War II was still the major industrial center for the United States, and it used a lot of natural gas. And there's a lot of references to its superiority in temperature control and high quality product manufacture, especially in the World War II era with all the military stuff and industrial production that was needed. So the gas was starting to kind of wane in World War II. So that's when they connected the Western gas fields basically through the Midwest to Appalachia. So there was a pipeline called the Panhandle Eastern that had made it all the way into Ohio, but there's a lot of regulatory and anti-competitive type or competitive type barriers. But during the war, they actually connected the Panhandle Eastern to the Appalachian gas network early in the war. But then they built another pipeline called the Tennessee Pipeline from East Texas into Tennessee and then up into Appalachia as well. It went up to West Virginia. And that came in 1944 towards the end of the war, but it was like the U.S. industrial production was reaching its peak. And we were in the decisive phase of World War II. And then right at that time, that winter, 44 to 45, was like one of the coldest winters in history. And so without that pipeline, it could have been pretty bad. And then there were other long distance gas pipelines that came in that after World War II and connected to the last remaining kind of manufactured gas supplied cities like Philadelphia, New York City, and then New England. And as you mentioned, after World War II, basically by the mid-50s is when natural gas had expanded across most of the United States and displaced the old manufactured gas systems, which were based primarily on coal.
Yeah, I like you talk about the big inch pipelines and the little inch, big inch and little inch, and
Yes.
what Canada did something similar where we had the big inch pipelines, and in the 1950s was this boom period of connecting the resources in the heartland, which is
Yeah.
Alberta, Saskatchewan, and part of northern British Columbia, to the population industrial centers. And so, of course, pipelines, especially in Canada where the navigable rivers don't really exist too much, the pipelines were the way to
Yes.
go. Or they did start with trains, but the trains weren't as efficient, and so they built the pipelines.
Yes.
And it's kind of funny that over the past 15 years they went back to trains because it's been impossible to build any pipelines
Mm-hmm.
anymore. But one of the fascinating things with the natural gas in Canada and the United States is that it took the Korean War to allow for the export of Canadian natural gas to the United States. And it was like this really big controversy to some extent in America, because they're like, we don't want this factory to be dependent on a
Yes.
foreign country like Canada. They could turn the tap off, but they need it for this. I think it
Yeah.
was a copper mine or something, the Anaconda mine, and they needed the natural gas. And sometimes the north south is much easier to do, shorter, cheaper than trying to run something
Yeah.
across the extent of the continent. So.
Well, that's another fact. I don't get into all the details in this book because it's focused on, the United States, but the interrelationships between the United States and Canada are fascinating. So I've been to, many places in Canada. I've been into big companies like, former TransCanada, now TC Energy, Enbridge, the other ones, and then the big producers. But of course, ExxonMobil owns Imperial Oil.
Yeah.
Which, ExxonMobil's a descendant of John D. Rockefeller's Standard, and they were in there from the beginning. And and then the pipeline networks, it's fascinating to see. I mean, Enbridge and TC Energy have huge pipeline networks within the United States.
Yeah.
And as you mentioned, like Enbridge, their lines actually, they start in Canada and then they dip into the United States and then go back into Canada, and they're very important for Eastern Canada. So,
Yeah. It's funny because that was in the 1950s. It was a huge debate in Canada. Should the pipeline go straight across and not go through the United States, or because it's actually easier to go through the United States and then up
yeah.
instead of trying to go across the Canadian Shield? It would add extra kilometers, and it was terrible terrain and everything. So yeah, it's funny how those things kind of turn out, at least after the war.
And it's interesting too, because, there's all the talk these days about energy security, energy dominance, and all that, which, I definitely support. It's just, if you look at history, though, I mean, there was a time when it was actually kind of thought in some quarters to be good to import from other places so we don't use all of it up here. And so I think that's actually a valid thing to think about, especially on the oil side. Canada, the oil sands, Canada has top 5 easily oil reserves in the world, and they're our best friend. And why not? And it makes economic sense too, because our refineries, especially in the Midwest and Gulf Coast, as U.S. light sweet production peaked in the 70s, they started retooling to be able to import Latin American heavy sour crude from Mexico, Venezuela, and so forth, but also the Canadian oil sands, especially in the 90s.
Yeah.
And now they're the best at refining that stuff. And then with the unconventional revolution, which is mostly light sweet crude, that there's only so much that the U.S. refining system can absorb of that, so that can be exported. And as I point out in the book, that has been a huge benefit in the last 10 to 15 years, stabilizing the world oil markets. So it's removed the United States. We still import a lot of oil, but it's mostly from Canada and Latin America. And then, it's reduced a huge portion of U.S. imports and it's also increased exports from the United States, which is a stabilizing influence, around the world as there's these, instability in the Middle East or Europe or whatever. So it's a
Yeah,
win-win situation.
that's an excellent point, because quite often people will say that because we have a lot of oil, but we don't influence the price because we don't put enough onto the world market. The thing is, we put a lot into the American market, like you say,
Mm-hmm.
and we have this synergy between Canada and the United States, and there's some American oil that comes up to the East Coast, and it's a little bit complex. But if we took that oil away from going into the United States, then that would affect the global price.
Yes.
And so it's a bit of, I'm glad you pointed that out, because it was a huge problem in the late 50s, early 60s of how do we there's all these new finds in the world. We have the Middle East, where they found these spectacular fields, but Europe doesn't have a lot of indigenous resources. And we need to be able to, from the American diplomatic thinking, the Middle East needed to be able to sell their oil and to be able to develop their resources so that the Russians or the Soviets don't get involved there.
Yes.
And so there were these different dynamics going on. And I thought you did a really good job of talking about it and explaining why, the United States was struggling to make these decisions, trying to do this balancing act. And in the end, in 1959, they had to do the mandatory oil quotas because the independent producers were getting upset, saying, well, how can we be prepared for a hot war if we're put out of business because all of this Middle Eastern oil and the Venezuelan oil and the Canadian oil is coming in, and so you need to protect us. And so it was a tough job at that period to try and keep that keep the world happy, I guess, and keep locals happy.
Well, it's Middle East is it's kind of it's always been a bugaboo in the United States. It's kind of the poster child for, hey, why are we importing oil from these unstable regions that hate us? But it's a very important region. I mean, the fact of the matter is they have the lowest cost, largest reserves in the world. And a lot of people forget, too, that it was extremely important, especially after World War II. So the United States, American companies took a leading role in developing those fields in the 1930s. There was kind of a break during World War II, but then after World War II. And after World War II, the United States was still increasing production, but demand exploded as all our service people came back. The economy was growing, and then all the rationing was lifted. So huge amounts of demand. We couldn't continue. We supplied 90% of the oil, during World War II, and we couldn't do that anymore. Meantime, you have Europe, which is almost completely destroyed, parts of it, and Asia, East Asia, and the main place that was available to supply them. They also had coal shortages in Europe, and they had extremely cold winters in the late 1940s. Middle East was a huge, very important area for supplying Western Europe and places like Japan and Korea as they were trying to recover from the war and then holding off, communism. So Middle East is important. It remains important. I mean, you can see we're still I think President Trump is over there right now, and he's dealing with the Saudis. The Saudis are kind of the center of that relationship. So it's a balance that's tough to strike, but I don't know. My position is always, if it's not the United States, who's it going to be? Who do you want? You want the Russians controlling the area? Do you want the Iranians or the Chinese? So we're definitely not perfect. We make a lot of mistakes, but I think, all being said and done, we've been a pretty good stabilizing force for the most part, since World War II.
So just to kind of move it forward a little bit, how do you think, because, when we talk about trying to look after these different sort of global dynamics, and then we have the Middle East executing or using the oil weapon in the 70s, and we have the energy crisis. So, in the United States reaches peak oil production, 1970, 71. Then there's the various agreements of, the two pillar strategy, where Iran was going to be the sort of military arm in the Middle East, and Saudi Arabia was going to be the swing oil producer globally, and that's how they would keep stability and prevent the Soviet Union from coming in. And then we have the Russian oil, what they called the Russian oil weapon, where they were flooding the market to keep the prices low and stuff. So then we have the oil crisis, and then there's environmental concerns happening.
Mm-hmm.
So how did all of that sort of reshape the American hydrocarbon industry?
Yeah, it's a fascinating story. So I think you mentioned earlier in the call here, oil had been increasingly used in through the 50s, 60s, into the 70s for electric power generation, as had natural gas. And I get into some of the reasons for that. The natural gas, the regulatory regime was kind of set up for kind of in the Depression era, and it encouraged certain types of uses that didn't end up being good. And then it discouraged natural gas exploration. And there were actually shortages showing up even in the late 60s before the energy crisis. But it all came to a head in the 70s. And that's when, as we've discussed, we went back to coal for a lot of electric power generation. So stopped, basically banned building new gas plants, and oil basically got squeezed out pretty quickly. Coal, because of the subbituminous coal in mainly Wyoming and Montana, it was lower in sulfur at the time. And then the United States also restructured the railroads, including the old coal lines, which were in a dire straits at that point. So all that came together, and that coal was now economic to produce. It's easy to mine. It's huge surface mines out on flat land. Yeah. And it could be transported economically pretty much all over the United States. And so that's something I didn't even know. U.S. electricity demand basically doubled from the 1970s to about 2010. So you don't realize that, and coal generated 50% of electric power during that time. So pretty important for especially the 80s, 90s, early 2000s, that economic growth that the United States had. I think coal played a pretty important role. And at the same time, the oil and natural gas industries were restructured, especially natural gas, but even oil. So oil, as I write in the book, is, it's exposed to international prices at that point by the early 80s. So with the NYMEX crude future and all that. Natural gas is restructured through the 80s into the early 90s, and then emerges, and then all that comes together. They're trying to figure, some of it coming out of the energy crisis. There's incentives and there's research and so forth to find new sources of oil and natural gas and so forth. And all that kind of comes together in the early 2000s, late 90s, early 2000s with the unconventional revolution. And now, fast forward 20, 25 years, the United States is producing more oil than ever before, more natural gas than ever before, and exporting a lot of it, exporting NGLs and so forth. So it's really a fascinating, and it's rearranged the entire energy picture in the world. And then, it's had a lot of geostrategic benefits to the United States and its allies. And, just a lot of fascinating interrelationships. So we've been talking about Canadian oil sands. That's one of the areas that almost no one knows about, but it's natural gasoline, which is an NGL produced primarily from natural gas. It's used as a diluent for oil sands crude. So it's piped up from the United States, because we have a ton of it, goes up there, and they mix it with the heavy sour crude, and then that allows it to be piped back down into the U.S. Midwest. So just another fascinating synergy between, in this case, natural gas liquids, and, oil.
That's a great point. There is so many synergies across the border. Like the possibility to be Fortress North America is there. It's just sometimes leaders get in the way. You talk about the unconventional revolution, and some call it the shale revolution. What do you think made that possible?
Well, I think, first we talked about at the beginning was the private mineral rights. So the ability, the number of wells that have been drilled in the United States is incredible. It's millions of wells. So there's just all that experience and so forth. So they've been drilling through these shales for, well over a century, and they know about, the geologists and others know about them. And they would occasionally get shows of oil and natural gas and natural fractures and so forth, but they were never economic to produce. So that was part of it, was just the legacy, the number of wells, the experience. But what really came together was there was kind of three main things. So it was hydraulic fracturing, which is not new. It had been done in the 40s,
Yeah.
and it was used in various places. And then but then they were trying all these different methods, and it was mainly this guy George Mitchell. There was a lot of other people involved. He wasn't the only one, but he was kind of the one that kept trying for a period of quite a number of years. And then there was directional drilling, which again was not new. It had been, angled drilling had been done for decades, and it was actually the Soviet Union had done some horizontal drilling, and then it was a French company that really did the first in the western areas, did the first directional drilling. But they figured out how to do that. But then what kind of enabled a lot of that was the computing power. So computers, and the ability to interpret the subsurface. So geology, geophysics is very computer intensive, petroleum engineering, all that stuff came together. So better technology, better subsurface interpretation, and then the ability to geosteer. So if you can identify these formations, but if you can't keep the drill bit in them, you're not doing yourself much good. But that horizontal drilling was what really enabled it as far as economics, because you could expose more of the formation to the bit. And then with the completion techniques, the fracturing and so forth, you can produce it sequentially, and it also reduced the surface impact. So you could drill wells from one pad basically all over the place, drill multiple wells, so you're not having to build a new pad everywhere and impact the surface, getting in the way of people's livelihoods or whatever. So all those factors came together. Some of it was economics due to the energy crisis in the 70s. So the prices and so forth, the incentivized some of these new things. There were government incentives as well. So, that's a point I try to make in the book too. The government, the federal government, so forth, is not always popular in oil and gas and hydrocarbon circles, but it's played a role, like it or not, and as have state governments and local governments. And that's one of the points I try to make. Is I think that's another advantage the United States has, is our federal system, which diffuses power across the branches of government, but also down across state and local governments. So we see through history state governments playing huge roles, like the Texas Railroad Commission, the Oklahoma Corporation Commission here in Oklahoma, and so forth. The states are kind of like laboratories for trying out different things. And then the federal government, it has a balancing act. It's a huge country. And you mentioned it, we have major international oil companies, the Exxon Mobils and so forth of the world. But then we also have our mom and pop small oil companies, and you have to balance those competing agendas. The smaller companies, the independent oil and gas companies, have much, they have a lot of political power because they're in the local areas. They have established relationships with state governments and congressmen and senators and so forth, so they can wield that power. But over time, it's always messy and dysfunctional. And you see stuff like Alaska, the North Slope of Alaska is, hey, we're going to drill it, and then the next president comes in and says, nope, we're not going to drill it. Or the Keystone XL pipeline, we're going to build it, and then the next president comes and says, we're cutting it off. So it is messy and dysfunctional, but it does seem to have kind of provided, at the end of the day, the United States with a robust portfolio, so to speak. So you get a lot of the dynamism, the new innovation techniques, the production out of the private mineral rights, the private lands. But we have huge areas of federal control, like offshore, Gulf of America, Gulf of Mexico, Alaska, and so forth, Western United States, and there's still a lot of hydrocarbons left in those areas that haven't even been touched or even explored. So the Gulf of Mexico is only half, if that, explored. Alaska, who knows how much is up there, and some of the other offshore areas, or the Western U.S. coal. There's a lot more of that.
Yeah.
So it seems like through all the messiness and dysfunction, it seems to work out over time somehow.
Somehow.
Yeah.
I know we didn't get to talk too much about it, and we're sort of running short of time, but I just wanted to mention that you do have some great sections in there about the offshore Gulf of America, Gulf of Mexico,
Yes.
and some of the developments there, and how the Louisiana Purchase was like this, actually a huge thing, and
Yes.
being able to develop that, and some of the technological innovations that went into putting the platforms out there and drilling and whatnot. And that was just an excellent, another excellent part of the book. As we kind of start to wrap up here, I'm wondering, what do you think are the biggest challenges and opportunities for U.S. hydrocarbons going forward?
Well, I think the environmental and climate type pressures that it's facing, sustainability is always an issue. And I purposefully, I cover some of that, but like I said, my purpose in writing this book was to focus on the positive aspects of hydrocarbons in the United States. And especially the climate side of things, that's kind of a rabbit hole that you can quickly get bogged down in. So that's always a challenge. But I think the interesting thing is how the hydrocarbon industry has progressed. And, I think the American hydrocarbon industry is one of the most, the advanced and cleanest ways to produce energy that there is out there. And you can see how it progresses because, with wood, it started with, most people used wood. They burned wood in their homes. Yeah. And they burned wood for industrial processes, but then that ended up cutting down a lot of the forests, which Britain experienced before. They basically cut down their entire tree cover. And then they started using coal. So coal played a huge role in regenerating some parts of the forests over time. But then coal has its own issues. It's dirty as far as burning it in your home and so forth. I mean, through the 1800s into the 1900s, like I mentioned in the book, my grandfather in the early 1900s, that's what they burned in their home, lignite, which is low quality coal, smoky. But over time, that's where people saw the value of natural gas. It's cleaner as far as for lighting and heating and cooking and so forth. So natural gas came in, but it was tougher to transport it and so forth. Oil also, even fuel oil, is cleaner in some cases. It's better for burning for industrial heat than coal. So you can see how things progress. And then what was interesting is, I point out that electricity, the United States wasn't fully electrified in rural areas, especially until the mid 1900s. Yeah. So again, I talked to my aunt and uncle, who are in their 90s now, but they remember those times. They didn't even have electricity in North Dakota. And he mentioned carbide. They had something I had never heard of. They had carbide lighting, which I haven't had a chance to dig into, but it's I forget they drip water on it and it generates a gas, which is piped into the house and then, lit like a gas light. So that was one thing they used in rural America and probably elsewhere, but those kind of progressions. So one of the things I point out towards the end of the book is the benefits of NGLs. And so, a lot of people don't realize there's probably around 1 billion people in the world that still don't have access to electricity. And then hundreds of millions, if not more, still burn wood or animal dung or other types of biomass in their homes. And that's the way it used to be done even here, Canada and where else, but that's not healthy to breathe smoke in like that all the time. If you sit around a fire pit, out when you're camping and you have to the smoke goes over you, no one likes to breathe that in. Well, a great solution for that is LPG, propane, butane mixtures that when I did that job in Latin America, it's where millions of people down in Latin America use propane or butane mixes on a daily basis. I mean, if you go to Mexico City and look at the rooftops, they're all propane tanks.
Yeah.
That's what they use. So, and that's much better than burning wood and stuff in these developing countries. So, and the United States has gone from basically nothing 15 years ago to being the largest LPG exporter in the world. And a lot of that goes to these developing countries. And I think that's a good thing. So I think that's one of the challenges the American hydrocarbon industry also is facing, is getting that message out. That's part of what I'm trying to, my little contribution here is to write this book, to kind of highlight the positive aspects of it, how it's made the United States what it is today in a lot of ways, but some of the positive things that it's doing and will continue to do for the future. And I think in some cases, the hydrocarbon industry has been its own worst enemy. And I think Alex Epstein is one of the places, he's really pointed this out effectively, they don't get out there, and they're doing it more now, but for a long time, they just tried to kind of hide in the background and say, yeah, I mean, there's all this bad stuff, but we're producing this stuff that's, everyone's using it. So, but getting that message out, hey, this is vital to your lifestyle. It's vital to national security. It's vital to a lot of other things is important. So.
Yeah, and I'm so grateful for this book to try and tie all of those different elements together. And it's a real tour de force of just the historical breadth of it, and a really nice general overview of how all of these different types of hydrocarbons are interconnected. And I'm so grateful that you wrote this book. Is so just to kind of to end, is there one thing that when you were doing the research that you were like, wow, I didn't know that. I really want people to know that too?
Well, it's the interrelationships between them, because even when I was with IHS, I learned a lot about it, but I didn't know all the historical interrelationships, especially. So as I get into in the book with the manufactured gas industry in the early 1800s, which used primarily coal to make a kind of a low heating value gas, mostly for lighting purposes. So the gas lights. And that gaslight system is survived into the mid 1950s in the United States in places like manufactured gas system, I guess. It kind of, right. As electricity came in, that gas kind of moved over towards heating and cooking applications. Well, one thing that actually made that possible later in the 1800s, when the oil industry got going, there was a guy, I mentioned him, his name is Thaddeus S.C. Lowe, and he figured out the Lowe process that he basically spray liquid hydrocarbons into these manufactured gas kilns or whatever, and that would increase the heating value of the gas. And the hydrocarbons were, at the time, naphtha, gasoline, and it ended up being a form of what's now diesel called gas oil. And so that actually gave the manufactured gas industry a new lease on life, because right around that time is when electricity was emerging. So light bulbs quickly displaced gas lights in urban areas. And so they were kind of looking for new things. And the fact that oil was there to spray into this manufactured gas process gave that gas a higher heating value. And then it allowed it to translate over more towards cooking and heating applications. And then that industry kind of laid the groundwork for the natural gas industry, the pipelines, the distribution, the metering, the billing, all that kind of stuff. Those kind of merged in a lot of cases with the electric into the huge power trusts in the early 1900s and so forth. So that's one example, but those interrelationships are fascinating, and I keep finding out more and more as I read more about the subject. So
that's fantastic. I want to show, for people who are watching, I'm holding the book up. It's American Heat Engine. I think my camera's on reverse, so it's backwards, but it's a fantastic book. I highly recommend it. And thank you, Kent, for writing it and for taking the time to chat with me about it today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me on. I appreciate it. It's hopefully my first podcast. So I've recorded one other one, but I'm still pretty new to this. So I appreciate you giving me the chance.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much. I'm just gonna press stop and it's gonna play the little exit music. And if you can just hold on, I'd like to just chat with you for a bit afterwards.
Sure.
Thanks again.
Thank you, Tammy.